Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are really undertaking a profound journey. I think it's fair to say this is one of our most challenging topics yet.
It definitely is.
We're wading into some very deep theological waters. The nature of divine action, the source material you've shared with us, the learner, is this incredibly robust scholarly defense against specific theological objections.
Yes, what the sources call shubuhat. And we're talking about the sifat al-fi'l, the attributes of action. These aren't just, descriptions. They are active defenses of statements from foundational sacred texts.
And the critics, they look at words like descending or laughing or even something like scheming, and they immediately say, wait a minute.
Right. They argue that these imply human imperfections, limitations, basically anthropomorphism.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission here, for you listening, is to really get to grips with the intellectual framework that allows these scholars to affirm these actions, but at the same time, protect the absolute uniqueness and perfection of the Creator. It all seems to hang on one core principle.
It does. The central governing principle is known as bila kaif. And this, it literally means without asking how.
Without asking how.
It's the intellectual rule that says we affirm the attribute exactly as it's stated in the text. That's isbat. But, and this is the key, we rigorously reject any attempt to define its mode, its mechanism, its physical nature. That's the kaif.
So to know the how would mean you'd have to know the divine essence itself.
Which is impossible for created beings. It immediately sets a boundary for human reason.
So we're analyzing how these major figures, we're talking about everyone from the early consensus to later masters like Ibn Taymiyyah, how they built this framework, a framework that affirms the texts while avoiding that huge theological pitfall of likening the Creator to creation.
And the sources are so thorough. They get into linguistic nuance, and they use this brilliant strategy of, well, intellectual consistency. They draw comparisons to similar descriptions in other sacred texts, Exodus, Genesis, the Psalms.
And not to argue for or against those texts, right?
Yes. Not at all. It's just to test the intellectual consistency of the objectors themselves. The question they pose is simple. If a certain action is flawed when you read it in one context, why is it perfectly acceptable to you in another?
This feels less like a summary of theology and more like an intellectual sparring match. It's all designed to protect the integrity of this concept of the divine. This is going to be essential for anyone trying to reconcile these profound statements with real intellectual rigor. Okay, let's start with what is probably the most famous, the most persistent objection, shubhat al-nuzul, the objection about the divine descent.
Right.
The core text, and it's cited everywhere in our sources, is the hadith that states, "The Lord descends to the lowest heaven every night during the last third of the night, saying, 'Who calls upon me, that I may answer him? Who asks me, that I may give him? Who seeks my forgiveness, that I may forgive him?'"
This is the definitive text affirming the attribute of descent, or nuzul. And critics, well, they seized on this immediately because on the surface, human descent implies movement, space, a change of location.
Which all suggests a limited physical body.
Exactly. And the sources mentioned that critics even brought up, these secondary weaker reports to try and hammer the point home. Things like the Lord descending on a camel or with a spirit that shakes itself, all to cement this idea of corporeality.
When I first read that hadith, my immediate, very human reaction was to ask, how? How can an infinite being occupy a lower created space? Doesn't that mean he's limited by physics? And that seems to be the exact challenge the early scholars had to face.
That is the core challenge. And the rebuttal is layered, it's profound. The very first argument is the bedrock, not like creation.
Okay.
They state very explicitly that the attribute of descent is an attribute of action that befits his majesty and greatness. The second you introduce the Creator, you have to abandon all created analogies. The Creator is, well, ontologically different from the created.
Yeah.
In essence, in attributes, in everything.
So his descent is simply not comparable to the descent of a body or, a person walking down a flight of stairs.
Not at all. The objection itself is based on assuming a human-like mechanism, and the response just negates that assumption entirely.
So they're saying the premise of the question is wrong.
Precisely. And this is captured so powerfully by scholars like Sudail ibn Iyad. He's quoted in our sources saying something like this. If the objector says to you, "I disbelieve in a Lord who descends," say to him, "I believe in a Lord who does what he wills."
Wow, that's a very powerful, almost confrontational statement.
It is, because it shifts the whole debate. It moves from the mechanics of movement to the fundamental sovereignty and perfection of the divine will. The objection is stuck on human limitations. The response forces you to focus on divine omnipotence.
That thought alone is a kind of intellectual anchor. If the divine can create the entire universe, then any action he performs, like descending, has to be understood as an act of absolute power, not some kind of constrained physical movement.
And that leads right into the second, equally critical argument, the question of how, or the kayf. This is where bila kayf becomes practical. We have to accept the truth of the statement, but we actively stop ourselves from trying to define its reality.
And we have that famous quote from scholars like Rabia and Malik. The establishment of the attribute is known, the how is unknown, belief in it is obligatory, and asking how is innovation. But why is asking how considered an innovation, or even dangerous? Why not just say, oh, it's a metaphor?
That's a fantastic question. They reject a purely metaphorical interpretation like saying his command descends or his mercy descends because they see that as denying the literal affirmation of the attribute of action itself.
So they believe the text clearly intended a real action.
Yes, and asking how is an innovation because it's an attempt to impose a created modality, a human mechanism, onto the uncreated essence. And that path inevitably leads to one of two errors. Tarshim, which is corporealization, or tashbih, likening him to creation.
So the answer is, we believe he descends, but the reality of that descent is utterly different from anything we can possibly imagine because his very essence is utterly different.
Exactly. Ibn Taymiyyah really drills down on this. He says the question of attributes is just like the question of the essence, the dot. If you can't describe the true reality of the Creator's being, then you certainly can't describe the true reality of his actions.
So demanding to know the kayf of his descent is basically demanding knowledge that's inherently beyond our capacity.
And beyond theological propriety. It elegantly dismisses the whole anthropomorphic objection, because the flaw the critics see is based entirely on them applying a created frame of reference, a human how, to an uncreated reality.
This then leads to a really interesting modern objection that the sources tackle what they call the geographical challenge.
Right, the time zone problem.
Exactly. Since night is always happening somewhere on the globe, when it's the last third of the night in London, it's midday in Tokyo. So if the descent happens every night, does that mean the Lord is just continuously descending across the globe? It seems to compound the problem of physical location.
And that is a legitimate logistical question if you're trying to reconcile a physical description with cosmic reality. It's a natural stumbling block.
So what's the scholarly answer to that?
The answer hinges entirely on belief in divine power and mastery over the cosmos. The response, which is rooted in Ibn Taymiyyah's teachings, stresses that once you affirm the Lord's omnipotence and his absolute mastery over all creation, and you remember that space and time are themselves created things, then you accept the truth of the prophet's statement without needing to reconcile it with the mechanics of the universe.
In other words, time and location are subject to his will, not the other way around.
Precisely. The objection is only valid if you start with the assumption that the descender is limited by the very laws of physics that he created. Once you remove that assumption, the descent becomes a simple act of sovereignty, not a logistical problem.
It's about starting from the right premise.
Yes. As one early scholar, Isaac ibn Rahway, reportedly said to a doubter, "It is not said of the Lord's command, how does he descend? He descends bila kaf, without a mode known to us." The solution is intellectual submission to the text's truth, combined with the realization that the divine modality is completely unique.
And to really hammer this home, the scholars in our sources use this comparative lens, which is such a powerful tool in these texts. They basically turn the question around.
They do, they ask. If descent implies a flaw or corporeality, does this same flaw apply to other sacred books that also describe descent?
And they bring specific examples.
Very specific. They reference the Lord descending in a cloud, descending onto Mount Sinai with fire, so the whole mountain smokes and trembles, descending to look at the Tower of Adam, descending in a pillar of cloud.
Okay, so why do those specific examples create such a problem for the objector?
Because the objector is applying a double standard. The sources point out that, for instance, the description of the Lord descending onto Mount Sinai, a fixed physical place, implies a very physical spatial relationship. It suggests the mountain is containing, or at least located beneath, the divine presence in a way that is pure tasim, pure corporealization.
So they're saying if you reject the nuzul in the hadith because it implies movement, you have to, with even more reason, reject the description of God being located on a mountain.
That's the critique. It's simple. If your objection is truly theological, then be consistent. If the flaw is movement, it's flawed everywhere. If it's location, it's flawed everywhere.
So whether we're talking about the descent to the lowest heaven for prayer or the coming of the Lord on the day of judgment, the core principle is the same. Believe that it happens, but absolutely refuse to define the physical mechanism.
That distinction is the only thing that preserves the concept of an unlimited creator. That is the unifying conclusion from scholars like Ibn Khuzaymah and al-Ajuri. The community affirmed the descent because the prophet told them about it, and they accepted the attribute without trying to project their own limited human experience onto it.
Okay, so having established that principle of bila kayf for actions related to location and movement, let's turn inward. Let's look at attributes that seem to touch on the divine's internal will, maybe even emotion. This brings us to shubhat al-taraddud, the dilemma of hesitation.
A very loaded word.
Extremely. The objection is that hesitation implies something human, like indecision or doubt, maybe a lack of foresight, and that would, of course, be a severe deficiency for the divine.
And the source text is, you have to admit, challenging. It's a hadith qudsi where the Lord says, I do not hesitate about anything I'm going to do as I hesitate about the soul of my believing servant who hates death, and I hate to displease him. If you read that with a purely human lens, it really does sound like an inability to decide what to do.
So how does the scholarly response manage to affirm a word like taraddud, hesitation, without implying ignorance? The nuance here must be razor thin to avoid contradicting omniscience.
It is the absolute pinnacle of nuance, and the sources lean very heavily on the sophisticated analysis of Ibn Taymiyyah here. He clarifies that this is absolutely not hesitation born of ignorance or indecision. That's the critic's faulty assumption.
Okay, so what is it then?
He defines it as the clash of two intentions. Taraddudatan. A clash of two intentions within the one divine will.
A clash of two intentions. Can you walk us through that? What are the two intentions that seem to be in conflict here?
Certainly. So intention number one is what's called the irada kauniyya, the universal or cosmic will. This is the will that decrees death. Death is necessary, it's unavoidable, it's part of the cosmic order.
Okay, that's fine.
Intention number two is the irada sharia, the legislative or the loving will. This will includes a profound disliking, the word is karaha, to cause displeasure or distress to his beloved righteous servant. And the servant naturally fears death.
So wait, the divine isn't struggling to decide whether or not to cause death. That's already been decreed. He is instead expressing a perfect appreciation of the sadness and the pain that this decreed action causes to the one he loves.
You've got it. It's a conflict between an absolute decree and an absolute love.
Wow.
The Lord's will includes decreeing death, but his love for his servant is so complete that he profoundly dislikes causing him displeasure. So this perfect understanding of these conflicting desires, where one necessary decree, death, has to prevail, while the secondary concern, the servant's distress, is perfectly felt and acknowledged, that is the true meaning of taraddud in this unique context.
That reframes the attribute completely. It's not a flaw. It becomes an affirmation of a comprehensive will and profound empathy, not a lack of foresight.
It confirms the divine's deepest empathy. It transforms what sounds like a flaw into a high point of perfection. It tells the believer, your Lord is so aware of your pain that he expresses this internal appreciation for the conflict between what is necessary and what he knows you feel.
It prevents the idea of the divine being some cold, distant entity that just executes decrees without any awareness of the impact.
Exactly. And this is where the comparative lens becomes so sharp. The scholars contrast this highly nuanced, affection-based definition of taraddud with descriptions found elsewhere, specifically Genesis 6.58.
Where the Lord is described as being filled with regret and sadness, a soft wallison for creating humanity.
Yes. And they explicitly ask, are these deep emotional states like nadam, regret, and huzn, grief, which seem to imply a change in internal knowledge or admitting a mistake, are they more befitting of the divine than this taraddud iradatain we just discussed?
So, if the critics accept a description that implies a fundamental change of heart or a miscalculation, why do they reject this incredibly nuanced clash of intentions, which affirms eternal knowledge and profound love at the same time?
That is the challenge they pose. It's a powerful question about their own criteria for what constitutes theological perfection. A very compelling point about consistency.
It really is. Okay, let's move to shubhat al-dak, the laughter of the Lord. The initial objection here is that this suggests, a lightness of spirit, maybe an undignified or human-like action.
The evidence for this attribute is quite clear in the sources. There's a hadith that states, the Lord laughs at two men, one of whom kills the other, yet both enter paradise.
Which refers to a specific scenario, right?
Yes. A believer is martyred in battle, and the killer later converts, becomes a devout believer, performs great deeds, and is himself martyred. The divine laughter here is at this magnificent paradox of justice and mercy playing out.
And then there's that incredible anecdote about the last man to enter paradise that really drives the point home.
It does. When that man is granted these vast, ever-increasing kingdoms in paradise, he finally asks the Lord, "Are you jesting with me? And you are the Lord of the worlds." And the Lord laughs in response. It's a laughter of overwhelming favor, acceptance, and goodness.
And importantly, the sources mention that the prophet himself also laughed when he recounted this story.
Yes, the narration from Ibn Masud says that he laughed at the Lord's laughter, which affirms the reality of the attribute while also underscoring its uniqueness.
So how do the scholars affirm this laughter without it tipping over into a human-like flaw?
The conclusion is that al-Dak is a true attribute of action, one that is suitable for His Majesty, and it's affirmed bila kaif. Ibn Taymiyyah argues that laughter, when it's appropriate, is actually a sign of perfection and completeness. The opposite, being perpetually sullen or abuse, would be the real defect.
So this laughter is a sign of supreme favor and delight in the righteous actions of his servants.
Exactly. As one of the companions, Abu Razin al-Akili, said when he heard this hadith, his logical conclusion was, "We will not be deprived of good from a Lord who laughs."
It feels like the critic's projection of human lightness of spirit onto this divine laughter is the real error. It's not about that. It's a manifestation of perfect pleasure and approval.
And again, the comparative analysis is razor sharp. The scholars point out that other sacred texts also describe the Lord laughing, but often in a very different context.
A context of mockery.
Yes, mockery or ridicule. He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord scoffs at them, from Psalms. Or, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you, from Proverbs.
And that is a crucial distinction. The laughter that's affirmed in the Hadith is linked to profound favor and goodness, whereas these comparative examples link divine laughter to mockery and scoffing at human calamity, which, by the critic's own standards, would seem to carry a much stronger connotation of a negative, human-like emotional reaction.
Precisely. The goal of the scholars is to show that the objections are often driven by selective reading, and they fail to apply their own standard of perfection consistently across all the material they're willing to accept.
Okay, let's transition into what is, I think, a highly sensitive area, attributes that relate to strategy and retaliation. We have to start with Shuhat al-Makr, divine maneuvering or plotting.
Yes.
The objection here is fierce. Calling the Lord a schemer, a makir based on verses like, "They schemed and God is the best of schemers," is seen by critics as a severe theological insult.
This section absolutely requires linguistic precision. The sources are very clear that the word mocker has multiple definitions in Arabic. It can mean subtle strategizing, it can mean deception, or it can simply mean perfect planning tadbir.
So the word itself isn't intrinsically negative.
Not at all. It can be used in a very praiseworthy sense in Arabic to describe successfully outwitting an enemy using superior intellect and strategy.
But the key theological principle that governs its use here is al-muqabala, or reciprocity. That's what stops it from being misunderstood as some kind of malicious planning.
That is the absolute key to this entire section. The sources stress that the attribute of mocker is never used alone to describe the divine. You will not find al-makir, the schemer, among the beautiful names of God.
It only appears in response.
Only in response, muqabala, to the wicked schemes of disbelievers. It is strategic retaliation. It is an act of justice.
So the human scheme is based on oppression, falsehood, and malice. The divine scheme, then, is a justified counter-strategy, and it's the ultimate display of justice and wisdom prevailing over that falsehood.
Exactly. God's makr is defined as a righteous, wise, and just punishment and counter-strategy. The sources quote interpretations, defining it as his gradual drawing out of the wicked istidraj, or as his perfect counterplan that completely foils the enemy's malicious intent.
So he is the best of schemers because his scheme is ultimate, perfect justice, executed with inescapable efficacy.
That's it. This isn't malice. It is perfect justice being served. And this principle of reciprocity extends to similar concepts, like deception, kadia, and plotting, kaid.
It's a consistent rule, then.
A very consistent rule. The sources cite verses like, "They seek to deceive God, but he deceives them, and they are plotting a plot, and I am planning a plan." In every single case, the divine action is contextual, it's retaliatory, and it's perfectly just. These attributes, when used by the divine, actually constitute the highest form of goodness and wisdom, precisely because they are deserved and executed with perfect justice against wickedness.
And the sources are explicit that because these attributes aren't always or intrinsically perfect in themselves, they aren't used as standalone, unqualified names of God.
That separation is essential. It reinforces the idea that they are purely attributes of action linked to a specific, just purpose of response. If the objection were to stand, you'd have to argue that the divine should just allow human scheming to succeed without any counter-strategy, which completely contradicts the concept of an all-powerful, all-just ruler.
And the comparative lens here is particularly sharp, isn't it?
It is. The scholars ask why critics condemn this divine mocker, which is clearly retaliatory justice, but they seem to accept similar or even stronger concepts in other texts, like God sending a powerful delusion so that they will believe the lie, or actively misleading a prophet, where the divine seems to be the one initiating the delusion or the error. The word is Eidlal.
So if the issue is the word itself, why is retaliatory justice rejected while proactive delusion is accepted?
It forces a profound reflection on intellectual consistency.
It really does. Let's move on to Shubhat al-Bud wal-Kara, divine hatred and dislike. The objection is pretty straightforward. Possessing these negative human emotions must imply an imperfection.
And the scholarly response is an unequivocal affirmation. They are necessary attributes of action for perfect justice. These are not, fleeting human emotions. They are deliberate decrees that have cosmic consequences.
The famous hadith that details this cosmic impact is very striking.
It is, if the Lord loves a servant, he calls the angel Gabriel, who announces this love in the heavens, and acceptance is then placed on earth for that person. Conversely, if he hates a servant, Gabriel is called to announce this hate, and Bagda, hatred, is placed on earth.
So this isn't arbitrary dislike. It's a manifestation of divine justice and judgment against wickedness.
Yes. It's not a personal, petty human emotion. It's a deliberate decree with tangible public consequences. We also have clear evidence for intense dislike, Kara, like the verse where the Lord disliked their going forth to battle and held them back, or the hadith where he dislikes useless talk, squandering wealth, excessive questioning.
So these attributes serve as a foundation for ethical conduct.
They have to. Ibn al-Qayyim asserts that attributes like love, pleasure, anger, and hatred are among the greatest attributes of perfection, precisely because they are necessary for righteous action.
The implication for you, the listener, is that divine love and hate are necessary perfections. They ensure righteous action, and they establish the ethical foundation for what's called the strongest bond of faith, loving for the sake of God and hating for the sake of God.
Absolutely. To deny that the divine hates certain actions or certain people, as some theological schools tried to do, would mean denying the theological basis for opposing evil and injustice. It would mean the Lord is indifferent, which for a just judge would be the ultimate imperfection.
And the comparative lens here notes that external texts also confirm the Lord hating specific things, hating pillars, or the 6 or 7 things in Proverbs, but they also highlight an internal contradiction in one source.
Yes, from the Book of Wisdom. You love all things that exist and detest none of the things that you have made, for you would not have made anything if you had hated it. That apparent contradiction, the idea that the Creator loves all things while also being described as hating specific things, is used by the scholars in our sources to demonstrate the necessity of their rigorous Bilakai framework. They are striving for a theology that consistently affirms perfection and negates any hint of a flaw.
Okay, we continue this examination of seemingly human states, moving now to Shubhat al-Malal, the myth of divine boredom or weariness. This objection comes from the hadith. For God does not tire until you tire, and critics just leap on this.
They do. They claim it implies malal, which means boredom or weariness, a clear imperfection in the divine. This is a crucial section for understanding how these scholars deal with language that seems to touch on imperfection. The whole defense relies on very sophisticated linguistic and contextual interpretation.
So what are the primary scholarly interpretations that save this attribute from that charge? The sources laid out 3 distinct lines of thought.
Right. The first, which was offered by some early figures, is probably the least popular today, but it's worth noting. It's a literal affirmation, but perfect. They just affirm malal as an attribute of perfection, insisting its meaning is entirely unlike human weariness.
That's consistent with Bilakai, but it requires the listener to accept a pretty difficult term.
It does, and I think most scholars found that too hard to reconcile with divine self-sufficiency. So the second and much more common interpretation is the metaphorical consequence reading. This is favored by later scholars like Ibn Uthaymin. Here, the meaning is that God will not cease rewarding your action until you cease acting.
So the word malal is referring to the cessation of reward, the consequence, not the divine state itself.
Exactly. The cause, your tiring, and the effect, the reward stopping, are linked by the idiom, but the divine is completely free of the cause, which is weariness.
That reframes it completely. It's a promise of perpetual reward linked to human persistence. You get tired, your reward stops. He never gets tired, so if you keep going, the reward keeps flowing.
Precisely. And the third interpretation is the grammatical negation reading, which was championed by figures like Ibn Qutayba. The idea here is that the phrasing, God does not tire until you tire, is just an Arabic idiom that means God never tires, even if you do.
Like saying, this marathon runner won't stop until his competitors do, when what you really mean is that the runner just never stops.
Exactly that. It's an idiom meant to praise the runner's incredible endurance. So this interpretation strongly reinforces the theological consensus. No matter which linguistic approach you take, the Lord is fundamentally free from all imperfections, including any human concept of weariness or boredom.
And the contrast they draw.
They contrast this very careful interpretation with an external source from Jeremiah that states the Lord grew tired of relenting. The key word there is tired of relenting, which implies a direct change in divine disposition because of human action, a much clearer attribution of human-like weariness than the carefully interpreted hadith.
Next up is divine astonishment, shubhat al-ajab. The question is, how can the Lord exhibit ajab, or astonishment, which implies encountering something unexpected if he's omniscient?
The primary text here is the verse, "Nay, you wonder, and they ridicule." And the scholars immediately address the linguistic complexity. They confirm there are two valid recitations of that word, ajibta, which means you wonder, referring to the prophet, and ajibtu, which means I wonder, spoken by God.
So if we accept the reading where the divine is speaking, ajibtu, how is this attribute affirmed without implying ignorance?
It is affirmed as a confirmed attribute of action. But the scholarly clarification is critical. Divine ajab here means the magnification or condemnation of an action, not encountering something previously unknown. The Lord's astonishment is a reflection of the sheer magnitude of the disbelief in the resurrection, or the magnificence of an act of faith.
So if a human is astonished, it means, wow, I didn't know that was possible. But if the divine is astonished, it means this action is so magnificent, or this disbelief is so heinous that it deserves an extraordinary level of attention.
That is the distinction. It completely avoids ignorance and becomes a mechanism for teaching humans the value or the gravity of an act. And the sources bring multiple hadiths to prove this attribute. The Lord was astonished at so-and-so, referring to a host and his wife who sacrificed their only meal for a jest. Or, the Lord was astonished at a people who enter paradise in chains, people captured in war who then embrace the faith so sincerely.
So this astonishment is a sign of extreme favor and appreciation for magnificent faith, not surprise at something unknown.
Yes. And the comparative critique here points out that in other texts, Jesus, described as the Lord by some, is also described as being astonished tajab by the faith of a centurion. It's used to demonstrate consistency. If astonishment is accepted in one context as a magnification of an extraordinary act, it must be accepted here.
Finally, for this section, let's discuss shubhat al-asaf al-tahasur, grief and regret. The objection is that the Lord experiences asaf, which is regret or grief, citing the verse, alas for the servants, and when they angered us, asafuna, we took vengeance upon them.
The interpretation of that word asafuna is crucial for this whole section. The consensus among major scholars like Ibn Garir is that asafuna does not mean they grieved us. It means they angered us deeply, atabuna. It reflects intense wrath.
And the context of the verse supports that.
Completely. Wrath, or gadab, is confirmed as a perfected divine attribute, and the vengeance that follows the anger solidifies the meaning. It's about severe displeasure, not sorrow.
Okay, and what about that expression of grief? Ya hasratan alay alibad, alas for the servants.
That expression, both linguistically and contextually, is attributed to the servants themselves, regretting their own foolish actions in the afterlife, or perhaps to the angels grieving for the misguided people, but emphatically not to the Lord. This interpretation maintains the divine's freedom from the imperfection of grief or sorrow over the past.
And once again, the comparative lens provides a stark contrast.
It directly contrasts this rigorous refutation of divine grief with the explicit description in Genesis, where the Lord grieved and regretted in his heart, creating man. The scholars highlight that the critics themselves affirm a form of emotional regret, nalatam, that the responding theology rigorously refutes as a description of the divine. It just demonstrates that their goal is to maintain absolute theological perfection.
We move now to actions of divine intervention, and we're starting with a very delicate topic, شبهات النفخ في مريم. This is about the divine breath or spirit associated with the conception of Jesus.
Yeah.
The phrasing, we breathed into her Mary's private part from our spirit, Rahina, is used by critics to argue for anthropomorphism.
The clarification provided by the sources, citing Ibn Kathir, immediately tackles that human-linked interpretation. It clarifies both the agent and the location.
Okay, so the agent of the blowing wasn't God directly.
Nope, it was the angel Gabriel acting on God's command. And the physical action, as described in more detailed accounts, took place in the sleeve or the collar of her garment. The Jabdirihai, not the anatomical location that a literal reading of the word farj in that verse might imply. Farj can just mean an opening, and here it refers to the opening of her garment.
So the action was indirect, carried out by an angel, and the physical location is interpreted contextually to preserve the narrative of chastity. But the more critical point, I think, is the clarification of ru'ina, our spirit.
This is perhaps the most crucial theological distinction in this entire section. The sources emphasize that Ru, the spirit, is a created entity. It is not an uncreated divine attribute like God's knowledge or his word.
And that's to safeguard against the belief that the spirit is some kind of fragment of the divine essence.
Exactly. So the question becomes, how is its attachment to the divine, our spirit explained, if it's a created thing?
Right.
It's what's called an addition of honor and possession. Idafat mulk wa tashrif. It means the spirit belonging to us, an entity that is honored by its immediate association with the divine. The sources use analogies like the house of God for the Kaaba, a created building honored by association, or the she-camel of God, a created animal honored by association.
So it's not a part of God, but a creation of God that is uniquely honored.
Yes. Scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim confirm that the spirit is created, and its association with God does not imply it's a part of the divine essence. And the sources note that external accounts also describe the Lord blowing the breath of life into Adam or the conception of Jesus via the Holy Spirit. The idea of intervention via a spirit or breath is widespread, but the interpretation of the Ruh as a created entity is what protects the theology from the charge of anthropomorphism.
Let's discuss Shubhat Allah al-Tabib, the divine physician. The objection here is that calling the Lord the physician al-Tabib is a diminishment, linking him to a human profession.
The hadith that clarifies this is fascinating because it elevates the term. When a man said, "I am a physician," the Prophet corrected him. He said, "God is the physician, Allah al-Tabib." Rather, "You are a gentleman, Rafiq. The physician of the sickness is he who created it."
So it redefines al-Tabib not as a human doctor with limited knowledge, but as the all-knowing al-Adlim who perfectly knows the location of the ailment and the exact cure.
The human is merely a gentle helper, a Rafiq, who attempts the treatment. But the true knowledge and power of healing, al-Shifa, belongs solely to the divine.
The human is the intermediary, but the efficacy is divine.
Exactly. Abraham's statement is cited as confirmation. And when I am ill, it is he who cures me.
Let's turn to an attribute of perception. Shipat Sham Rihat al-Sa'im, the scent of the fasting person. Critics claim this implies the Lord literally smells or has the physical attribute of Sham, smell.
And the hadith is the core evidence. The odor of the mouth of the fasting person is more pleasant to God than the scent of musk. The scholarly response here explicitly denies that this implies a physical sense of smell. To attribute a physical nose or a mechanism of detection to the divine would completely violate Bilakaf.
So what, then, is the interpretation of more pleasant, or istitaba?
Quoting Ibn al-Qayyim, the meaning of more pleasant is profound acceptance, approval, and honoring the deed. It's a metaphor. It's used to communicate the immense value and the magnitude of divine pleasure to our finite human minds.
By comparing it to the most beloved scent known to humans, musk.
Exactly. If the critics accept God's pleasure, Rita, without likening it to human pleasure, they must also accept istitaba without likening it to human smelling. The sensory language is purely for us, the human recipients, to understand the value. It's a mechanism for communicating immense spiritual value through a physical analogy.
Okay, let's address actions of force. Shubhat al-Qatla wa al-Rami, killing and throwing. The confusion here is over human actions being attributed to the Lord, specifically in the Battle of Bid-Daktarpar. It was not you who killed them, but God killed them. And you did not throw when you threw, but God threw.
This verse is absolutely foundational for understanding the interplay between human action and divine efficacy. Ibn Taymiyyah clarifies this principle. This is not a denial of the prophet's action. He did throw the dust. It is a denial of the effect or the efficacy of his action.
So the physical casting of the dust was the prophet's action, but the subsequent miracle, the effective outcome, was God's action.
Precisely. The miracle was that the small handful of dust the prophet cast somehow reached everyone in the enemy army and blinded them. That's humanly impossible. So the Lord performed the miraculous transmission and the achieving of the effect, which is Iyal. The prophet performed the initial physical casting, Edith.
The ultimate power and efficacy remains solely with the Creator.
Yes. And the source emphasizes that denying the prophet's initial action would lead to some ridiculous conclusions. It would be like claiming a non-believer didn't really disbelieve, but that God disbelieved through him. No. Both actions happen, but the efficacy of the final result belongs to the divine.
And this aligns perfectly with the understanding that all life and death are ultimately controlled by God, regardless of the human instrument involved.
Finally, we have Shubhat al-Rad, thunder as divine logic. The objection suggests that thunder is the Lord's logic and lightning is his laughter.
The Hadith says that the Lord initiates the clouds, and they speak in the best speech and laugh the best laughter. So if this isn't attributed to the divine directly, what is the scholarly interpretation?
Scholars like Ibn Kathir and al-Tahawi clarify that this is a classic example of Arabic literary usage. It's istiara, or metaphorical expression. The speech, nuk, of the cloud is the thunder, rad, and its laughter is the lightning bark.
So it's an idiom, like how an Arab poet would describe a laughing garden to mean it's full of blooming flowers?
Exactly like that. The prophet used language and idioms that were common and understood by his audience. This interpretation relies on standard Arabic linguistics. It does not attribute the literal actions of speech or laughter to the Lord in this context. It attributes them metaphorically to the cloud as a powerful creation of the Lord to demonstrate the magnificence of these celestial phenomena.
This has been a necessary and a really profound deep dive. It shows the incredible intellectual rigor required to engage with these texts. The level of consistency these scholars demand is just remarkable.
It really is. And the sources show that virtually all the objections we've reviewed, whether it's about dissent or hesitation or maneuvering, they all fundamentally hinge on one thing: likening divine attributes to human limitations, demanding a kayfiyat that simply cannot be known. The entire defense is about protecting the Creator's perfection.
And the scholarly responses were so consistent in their approach. Affirm the attribute of action as truth, but rigorously reject any form of anthropomorphism or tashbih. The method is just inviolable. Affirm what the sacred text says, ibad, but refuse to define the physical mechanism, bila kayf.
And this study is so valuable for you, the learner, because it demonstrates that theological consistency requires this dual commitment. You have to accept the text as truth, while simultaneously maintaining the utmost respect and reverence for the divine by distinguishing between the finite, flawed acts of creation and the infinite, unique perfections of the Creator.
So it's an intellectual exercise in simultaneous confirmation and denial of modality.
Yes. The entire defense of these attributes, therefore, it isn't about defending literal human actions. It's about defending the unlimited sovereignty and the unique perfection of the divine.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to think about.
Precisely. The sources reveal that the greatest defense against flawed theology is intellectual consistency. So here's the question. If one accepts complex, metaphorical, or seemingly anthropomorphic language, like a deity regretting an action or a deity being misled when it appears in one sacred tradition, while rejecting a much more nuanced definition like retaliatory justice or loving hesitation when it appears in another, is the objection truly about the attribute itself, or is it about the source of the information?
That requires true intellectual honesty to answer. A challenging and powerful question to end on. Thank you for guiding us through this demanding but essential material.
It was my profound pleasure.
We'll catch you next time for another deep dive.
आज की गुफ्तगू में खुश आमदेद। आज हमारे पास एक बहुत ही गहरा इल्मी और मजहबी मतन है जिसका उन्वान है शुबहात सिफात फ़ेल।
जी, यानी अल्लाह के उन कामों से मुताल्लिक सिफात जिन पर कुछ सवालात उठाए जाते हैं।
बिल्कुल, और ये सवालात इसलिए उठते हैं क्योंकि इन सिफात के लिए जो अल्फाज इस्तेमाल हुए हैं वो बज़ाहिर इंसानी अफ़आल और जज्बात से बहुत मिलते जुलते हैं।
सही। और हमारा मकसद यहाँ किसी अकीदे पर कोई फैसला सुनाना नहीं, बल्कि गैर जानिबदारी से ये समझना है कि ये मतन इन पेचीदा सवालात के जवाबात देता कैसे है।
जी, اور آج ہم اس متن کے ذریعے کچھ بہت ہی دلچسپ اور میں کہوں گا چیلنجنگ تصورات کا سفر کریں گے۔ ہم ظاہری طور پر جسمانی افعال جیسے نزول یعنی اترنے سے شروع کریں گے،
اور پھر ہنسنے اور تعجب جیسے جذبات کی طرف بڑھیں گے،
اور آخر میں مکر اور تردد جیسے سب سے پیچیدہ نکات کا جائزہ لیں گے، یہ سمجھنے کے لیے کہ یہ متن ان سب کو اللہ کی شان کے لائق آخر قرار دیتا کیسے ہے۔
دراصل اس ساری گفتگو کا مرکزی نقطہ ایک بنیادی اصول پر کھڑا ہے جو قرآن کی ایک آیت سے ملتا ہے، لیسا کا مثلہ شیئن،
یعنی اس جیسی کوئی چیز نہیں۔
بالکل۔ یہ متن بار بار ہمیں اسی اصول کی طرف واپس لائے گا کہ خدا کی ذات اور صفات بے مثال ہیں۔ آئیے دیکھتے ہیں کہ اس اصول کو عملی طور پر کیسے لاگو کیا جاتا ہے۔
تو چلیں اس کا جائزہ لیتے ہیں۔ متن کا آغاز ایک مشہور حدیث سے ہوتا ہے جس میں کہا گیا ہے کہ ہمارا رب ہر رات آخری تہائی پہر میں آسمان دنیا پر نزول فرماتا ہے۔
جی،
اب پہلا سوال ذہن میں یہی آتا ہے کہ نزول یا اترنے کا مطلب تو ایک جگہ سے دوسری جگہ حرکت کرنا ہے، تو کیا یہ متن اس کا یہی مطلب لیتا ہے؟
یہیں سے مطلب بحث کا آغاز ہوتا ہے۔ متن کا بنیادی موقف یہ ہے کہ اللہ کا نزول مخلوق کے نزول جیسا
نہیں ہے۔
جی بالکل نہیں۔ یہ ایک ایسی صفت ہے جو اس کے جلال اور عظمت کے لائق ہے، جسے ہم تسلیم تو کرتے ہیں لیکن اس کی کیفیت یا کیسے کو سمجھنے کی کوشش نہیں کرتے۔
اچھا،
اس حوالے سے پرانے علماء کا ایک بڑا زبردست اصول تھا۔ وہ کہتے تھے کہ استوا معلوم ہے، اس کی کیفیت مجہول ہے، اس پر ایمان لانا واجب ہے اور اس کی کیفیت کے بارے میں سوال کرنا بدعت ہے۔
اچھا، تو مطلب یہ ہوا کہ استوا کا مطلب تو معلوم ہے، یعنی بلند ہونا۔
جی مطلب معلوم ہے، لیکن وہ کیسے بلند ہوتا ہے یہ ہمیں نہیں معلوم، اور اس کیسے کے پیچھے پڑنا منع ہے۔ یہی اصول نزول پر بھی لاگو ہوتا ہے۔
تو یہ اصول ایک طرح سے ایک حد مقرر کر رہا ہے کہ یہاں تک انسانی عقل جا سکتی ہے اور اس کے آگے نہیں۔ یہ فریم ورک کتنا اہم ہے اس پوری بحث کے لیے؟
یہ تو اس بحث کی بنیاد ہے۔ یہ عقل کی حد کو تسلیم کرنا ہے۔ متن میں ایک واقعہ نقل کیا گیا ہے کہ جب ایک جہمی نے کہا کہ میں ایک ایسے رب کا انکار کرتا ہوں جو نزول کرتا ہے۔
ایک منٹ، یہ جہمی کون تھے؟ ان کا اس معاملے میں بنیادی نقطہ نظر کیا تھا جس کے جواب میں یہ بات کہی گئی؟
یہ ایک اہم سوال ہے۔ دیکھیں، جہمیہ اسلامی علم کلام کے ابتدائی مکاتب فکر میں سے ایک تھے جن کے بانی جہم بن صفوان تھے۔
اچھا،
وہ خدا کی ذات کو ہر قسم کی صفات سے پاک ماننے میں بہت آگے چلے گئے تھے۔ ان کا ماننا تھا کہ اگر ہم خدا کے لیے کوئی صفت ثابت کریں گے جیسے سننا، دیکھنا یا نزول کرنا،
تو اس سے خدا اور مخلوق میں مشابہت لازم آئے گی؟
بالکل، جو ان کے نزدیک توحید کے خلاف تھا۔ اس لیے وہ ایسی تمام آیات اور احادیث کی تعویل کرتے تھے یا ان کا انکار کر دیتے تھے۔
تو جب ایک جہمی نے نزول کا انکار کیا تو اس کے جواب میں جو رویہ سامنے آیا وہ یہ تھا کہ اللہ کے افعال کو مخلوق کے پیمانوں پر پرکھا ہی نہیں جا سکتا۔
جی، اسے جواب دیا گیا، میں ایک ایسے رب پر ایمان لاتا ہوں جو چاہتا ہے کرتا ہے۔
یہ تو بہت دلچسپ منطقی کشمکش ہے، لیکن آج کے دور میں ایک اور سوال پیدا ہوتا ہے۔ متن میں اس کا ذکر بھی ہے۔ اگر رات دنیا کے مختلف حصوں میں مختلف اوقات میں ہوتی ہے تو یہ نزول کا عمل مسلسل کیسے جاری رہتا ہے؟ یہ تو پھر ہر لمحہ ہوتا رہے گا۔
یہ ایک منطقی سوال ہے جو ہمارے وقت اور جگہ کے تصور سے پیدا ہوتا ہے۔ متن اس کا جواب شیخ الاسلام ابن تیمیہ کے حوالے سے دیتا ہے۔
اور وہ کیا کہتے ہیں؟
ان کا نقطہ یہ ہے کہ جو شخص اللہ کی لامحدود قدرت پر ایمان رکھتا ہے اس کے لیے یہ کوئی مسئلہ ہے ہی نہیں۔ وقت اور جگہ، دن اور رات کا یہ نظام، یہ سب اللہ کی تخلیق ہے۔
تو وہ اپنی ہی تخلیق کے قوانین کا پابند کیسے ہو سکتا ہے؟
بالکل، اس لیے متن کا موقف ہے کہ ہم حدیث پر ایمان لاتے ہیں اور اس کی کیفیت کو اللہ کے سپرد کر دیتے ہیں، کیونکہ اگر ہم اللہ کی ذات کی کیفیت نہیں جان سکتے تو ہم اس کی صفات کی کیفیت کیسے جان سکتے ہیں؟
صحیح۔ اچھا، متن میں ایک تقابلی پہلو بھی ہے جہاں وہ کتاب مقدس یعنی بائبل سے مثالیں دیتا ہے۔ اس کا کیا مقصد ہے؟
دراصل متن کا مقصد یہ دکھانا ہے کہ خدا کے اترنے کا تصور صرف اسلامی روایت تک محدود نہیں۔ وہ نقطہ یہ اٹھاتا ہے کہ اگر اس تصور کو خدا کے لیے عیب سمجھا جائے تو بائبل میں بھی اس کا ذکر موجود ہے۔ جیسے کتاب خروج میں لکھا ہے، پھر خداوند بادل میں اترا۔ تو متن کا سوال یہ ہے کہ اگر ایک الہامی روایت میں یہ قابل قبول ہے تو دوسری میں اس پر اعتراض کیوں؟ یہ دراصل اپنے دلائل کو مضبوط کرنے کی ایک کوشش ہے۔
تو ہم نے دیکھا کہ نزول جیسے بظاہر جسمانی فعل کو بھی اللہ کی شان اور قدرت سے جوڑا گیا ہے، لیکن اگلا نقطہ اس سے بھی زیادہ دلچسپ ہے، کیونکہ اس میں ایک ایسا تصور ہے جو انسانی جذبات سے بہت قریب لگتا ہے: ہنسنا۔
جی،
حدیث میں آتا ہے کہ اللہ دو آدمیوں کو دیکھ کر ہنستا ہے جن میں سے ایک دوسرے کو قتل کرتا ہے اور دونوں جنت میں داخل ہوتے ہیں۔ یہ تو بہت حیران کن بات ہے۔
بالکل، اور یہاں بھی وہی اصول دہرایا جاتا ہے۔ متن واضح کرتا ہے کہ اللہ کا ہنسنا مخلوق کے ہنسنے جیسا نہیں، جس میں کوئی جسمانی تبدیلی یا منہ کا کھلنا شامل ہو۔
تو پھر یہ ہے کیا؟
یہ دراصل اللہ کی رضا، اس کی خوشنودی اور قبولیت کی ایک اعلیٰ ترین شکل کا اظہار ہے۔
یہ دلچسپ ہے۔ تو کیا متن یہ کہتا ہے کہ یہ لفظ استعاراتی یعنی میٹافوریکل ہے، یا یہ کہ یہ ایک حقیقی صفت ہے جس کی حقیقت ہم نہیں جانتے؟ ان دونوں میں تو بہت بڑا فرق ہے۔
یہ بہت اہم نقطہ ہے، اور متن کا رجحان دوسری طرف ہے، یعنی یہ ایک حقیقی صفت ہے لیکن اس کی کیفیت ہماری سمجھ سے باہر ہے۔ وہ اسے محض استعارہ کہہ کر رد نہیں کرتا۔
اچھا،
اس کے نزدیک ہنسنا ایک صفت کمال ہے۔ ابن تیمیہ کا قول نقل کیا گیا ہے کہ ایک ہنسنے والی ہستی ایک ہر وقت اداس اور سنجیدہ رہنے والی ہستی سے زیادہ کامل ہے۔
واہ!
اس سے بھی زیادہ خوبصورت ایک بدوی صحابی ابو رزین العقالی کا قول ہے۔ جب انہوں نے سنا کہ رب ہنستا ہے تو انہوں نے فوراً کہا، ہم ایک ایسے رب سے خیر سے محروم نہیں ہوں گے جو ہنستا ہے۔
واہ! یہ تو واقعی ایک بالکل مختلف زاویہ ہے۔ انہوں نے اس میں کوئی فلسفیانہ بحث نہیں کی، بلکہ اسے سیدھا اللہ کی رحمت سے جوڑ دیا۔
بالکل، یہ فطری ایمان کی ایک بہترین مثال ہے۔
اسی سے جڑا ایک اور تصور تعجب کا ہے۔ قرآن کی ایک قرات میں ہے، بل عجبتو و یسکرون، یعنی اے نبی آپ نہیں بلکہ میں نے تعجب کیا اور وہ مذاق اڑاتے ہیں۔
جی،
اب تعجب تو ہمیں کسی نئی یا انوکھی بات پر ہوتا ہے۔ اللہ کے لیے اس کا کیا مطلب ہو سکتا ہے جس کے علم سے کوئی چیز باہر نہیں؟
صحیح۔ متن کے مطابق اللہ کا تعجب مخلوق کے تعجب جیسا نہیں، جو کسی چیز کو نہ جاننے اور پھر جاننے سے پیدا ہوتا ہے۔
تو پھر یہ کیسا تعجب ہے؟
اللہ کا تعجب دراصل کسی کام کی عظمت، اس کے غیر معمولی پن یا اس کی انوکھی نوعیت کا اظہار ہے۔ جیسے ایک حدیث میں آتا ہے، تمہارے رب کو ان لوگوں پر تعجب ہوتا ہے جو زنجیروں میں جکڑے ہوئے جنت میں داخل کیے جاتے ہیں۔
اچھا، زنجیروں میں جکڑے ہوئے جنت میں؟
جی، یعنی وہ پہلے کافر تھے، جنگ میں قیدی بنائے گئے، پھر اسلام لائے اور جنت میں داخل ہوئے۔ تو یہاں تعجب ان کے کفر سے ایمان تک کے سفر کی غیر معمولی نوعیت اور ان کے ایمان کی پختگی پر اللہ کی طرف سے ایک طرح کی ستائش کا اظہار ہے۔
تو ہم نے دیکھا کہ ہنسنا اور تعجب جیسے انسانی جذبات کو بھی اللہ کی رضا و کمال سے جوڑا گیا ہے۔ لیکن اگلا نقطہ اس سے بھی زیادہ پیچیدہ ہے، کیونکہ اس میں ایک ایسا لفظ استعمال ہوا ہے جو عام طور پر مکمل طور پر منفی سمجھا جاتا ہے۔
آپ مکر کی بات کر رہے ہیں؟
جی، قرآن میں ہے وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ، یعنی اور انہوں نے مکر کیا اور اللہ نے بھی مکر کیا اور اللہ بہترین مکر کرنے والا ہے۔
اس صفات میں سے ایک ہے۔
بالکل، مکر کا لفظ عام بول چال میں اتنا منفی ہے کہ اسے اللہ کے لیے تسلیم کرنا بہت مشکل لگتا ہے۔ کیا متن اس لفظ کے انتخاب کی کوئی خاص وجہ بتاتا ہے، بجائے کسی اور لفظ کے جیسے تدبیر؟
یہیں پر زبان اور سیاق و سباق کی اہمیت واضح ہوتی ہے۔ متن بتاتا ہے کہ عربی زبان میں مکر کا لفظ ہمیشہ منفی نہیں ہوتا۔
اچھا،
اس کا بنیادی مطلب ہے ایک خفیہ تدبیر یا منصوبہ بندی جو اپنے مقصد تک ایک غیر متوقع راستے سے پہنچائے۔ یہ تدبیر اچھی بھی ہو سکتی ہے اور بری بھی۔
تو جب یہ اللہ کے لیے استعمال ہوتا ہے
تو یہ ہمیشہ کسی کی بری تدبیر کے جواب میں ایک بہترین اور منصفانہ تدبیر کے معنی میں آتا ہے۔ یہ اللہ کی حکمت اور قدرت کو ظاہر کرتا ہے، نہ کہ دھوکہ دہی کو۔ اور یہ لفظ اس لیے استعمال کیا گیا تاکہ اس میں ایک بلاغت پیدا ہو کہ تمہاری خفیہ چال کے مقابلے میں اللہ کی خفیہ تدبیر ہے اور وہ کہیں زیادہ طاقتور اور منصفانہ ہے۔
تو اس کا مطلب یہ ہوا کہ اللہ کی یہ صفت صرف جوابی کارروائی کے طور پر آتی ہے، خود سے پہل کرتے ہوئے نہیں۔
بالکل، یہ کلیدی نقطہ ہے۔ متن اس بات پر زور دیتا ہے کہ اللہ کی یہ صفت ہمیشہ کسی دوسرے کے برے مکر کے مقابلے میں آئی ہے۔ اسی لیے اللہ کے ناموں میں الماکر یعنی مکر کرنے والا شامل نہیں ہے،
کیونکہ یہ صفت مطلقاً استعمال نہیں ہوتی۔
جی، یہ ہمیشہ ایک جوابی کارروائی ہے جو عدل پر مبنی ہے۔ یہ ان لوگوں کے منصوبوں کو ناکام بنانے کی تدبیر ہے جو حق کے خلاف سازشیں کرتے ہیں۔
متن میں اس حوالے سے ایک بہت عمدہ اصول بیان کیا گیا ہے، ناموں کی مشابہت سے ضروری نہیں کہ ان چیزوں میں بھی مشابہت ہو جن کے یہ نام ہیں۔ اسے ذرا آسان الفاظ میں سمجھائیں۔
اسے یوں سمجھیں کہ ایک انسان میں زندگی ہے اور ایک پودے میں بھی زندگی ہے۔ ہم لفظ ایک ہی استعمال کرتے ہیں، لیکن دونوں زندگیوں کی حقیقت بالکل مختلف ہے۔
صحیح، ایک میں شعور ہے، ارادہ ہے، حرکت ہے، دوسرے میں صرف نشو نما ہے۔
سے باہر اور بے مثال ہے۔
کوئی اور مثال؟
متن میں قرآن سے مثال دی گئی ہے کہ اللہ کو رؤوف اور رحیم کہا گیا ہے، اور نبی کریم صلی اللہ علیہ وآلہ وسلم کو بھی رؤوف رحیم کہا گیا ہے، لیکن ظاہر ہے کہ اللہ کی رحمت اور نبی کی رحمت کی حقیقت اور وسعت میں کوئی مقابلہ نہیں۔
تو اسی طرح اللہ کا مکر عدل اور حکمت ہے، جبکہ مخلوق کا مکر اکثر ظلم اور دھوکہ ہوتا ہے۔
آپ نے بالکل صحیح سمجھا۔
یہ مثال تو واقعی اس اصول کو بہت واضح کر دیتی ہے۔ اب آتے ہیں ایک اور حیران کن حدیث قدسی کی طرف۔ اس میں اللہ فرماتا ہے، میں جو کام کرنے والا ہوں اس میں کبھی اتنا تردد نہیں کرتا جتنا اپنے مومن بندے کی جان نکالنے میں کرتا ہوں۔
وہ موت کو ناپسند کرتا ہے اور میں اسے تکلیف دینا پسند کرتا ہوں۔
سچ کہوں تو تردد یعنی ہیزیٹیشن کا لفظ سن کر پہلا تاثر شک اور کمزوری کا ہی آتا ہے۔ یہ ایک بہت ہی جرأت مندانہ لفظ کا انتخاب ہے۔ متن اس کا دفاع کیسے کرتا ہے؟
آپ کا تاثر بالکل درست ہے۔ انسانی سطح پر تردد کا مطلب یہی ہوتا ہے جب ہم کسی کام کے انجام سے لا علم ہوں یا دو راستوں میں سے بہتر کا انتخاب نہ کر پا رہے ہوں۔
جی،
لیکن متن اس کی بہت گہری وضاحت کرتا ہے۔ ابن تیمیہ کے مطابق یہاں تردد علم کی کمی کی وجہ سے نہیں ہے، اللہ تو ہر چیز کے انجام سے واقف ہے۔
تو پھر
یہاں دراصل اللہ کی اپنے بندے سے شدید محبت اور رحمت کو بیان کرنے کے لیے یہ لفظ استعمال ہوا ہے۔
وہ کیسے؟ اسے تھوڑا اور کھولیں۔
دیکھیں، یہاں دو الہی ارادوں کا ٹکراؤ دکھایا گیا ہے۔ ایک طرف اللہ کا حتمی فیصلہ اور تقدیر ہے کہ اس بندے کی موت کا وقت آ گیا ہے اور اللہ اپنے اس فیصلے کو پورا کرنا چاہتا ہے۔
اور دوسری طرف اللہ اپنے مومن بندے سے اتنی محبت کرتا ہے کہ اسے موت کی تکلیف دینا پسند نہیں کرتا۔ تو ایک ہی عمل یعنی روح قبض کرنا ایک لحاظ سے اللہ کو مطلوب ہے کیونکہ یہ اس کا فیصلہ ہے، اور دوسرے لحاظ سے اسے ناپسند ہے کیونکہ اس سے اس کے محبوب بندے کو تکلیف ہوگی۔
بالکل۔ اس کشمکش کو، اس محبت بھری کیفیت کو تردد سے تعبیر کیا گیا ہے۔ یہ اللہ کی رحمت کی انتہا کو ظاہر کرتا ہے، نہ کہ کسی نقص یا کمزوری کو۔
یہ وضاحت تو واقعی بہت گہری ہے۔ یہ تو اس لفظ کو کمزوری کی علامت سے اٹھا کر رحمت کی سب سے بڑی نشانی بنا دیتی ہے۔
جی، اسی کے مقابلے میں متن بائبل کے سفر پیدائش کا حوالہ دیتا ہے، جہاں لکھا ہے خداوند زمین پر انسان کو پیدا کرنے سے ملول ہوا اور دل میں غمگین ہوا۔
اچھا،
متن کہتا ہے کہ اس غمگین ہونے میں ایک طرح کے پچھتاوے کا تاثر ہے، جبکہ حدیث میں بیان کردہ تردد خالصتاً محبت اور رحمت کا اظہار ہے۔
صحیح۔
اور اسی سے جڑا آخری نقطہ اسف کا ہے۔ قرآن میں ہے فَلَمَّا آسَفُونَا انتقمنا منہم، یعنی پھر جب انہوں نے ہمیں اسف میں ڈالا تو ہم نے ان سے انتقام لیا۔ کیا یہاں اسف کا مطلب افسوس یا غم ہے؟
نہیں، متن یہاں بھی زبان کی وسعت کی طرف توجہ دلاتا ہے۔ عربی زبان میں اسف کے دو معنی بڑے ہیں، ایک ہے شدید غم یا افسوس،
اور دوسرا ہے شدید غصہ۔ یہاں چونکہ آیت کا سیاق و سباق انتقام کا ہے، اس لیے مفسرین کے نزدیک یہاں اس کا مطلب شدید غضب ہے۔
اچھا، تو مطلب ہوا جب انہوں نے ہمیں شدید غضب دلایا تو ہم نے ان سے انتقام لیا۔
جی بالکل۔ اس طرح یہ صفت اللہ کے غضب سے جڑ جاتی ہے جو قرآن و حدیث میں ثابت ہے، نہ کہ افسوس سے، جسے ایک نقص اور کمزوری سمجھا جاتا ہے۔
تو آج کی اس گفتگو کا خلاصہ کیا ہے؟ ہم نے دیکھا کہ یہ متن اللہ کی صفات سے متعلق پیچیدہ سوالات کے جوابات ایک خاص اور بہت منظم اصول کے تحت دیتا ہے۔
جی،
اور بار بار ایک ہی مرکزی خیال سامنے آیا، اللہ کی صفات کو تسلیم کرو لیکن ان کی کیفیت کو مخلوق کی صفات پر قیاس مت کرو۔
بالکل، اور اگر ہم اس منہج کو سمیٹنا چاہیں تو اس کے 3 اہم ستون ہیں جن کا ذکر آپ نے شروع میں کیا تھا، لیکن اب وہ زیادہ واضح ہو گئے ہوں گے۔
وہ کیا ہے؟
پہلا، اثبات، یعنی اللہ نے جو صفات خود بتائی ہیں انہیں بغیر کسی تبدیلی یا انکار کے تسلیم کرنا۔ دوسرا، تنزیہہ، یعنی ان صفات کو مخلوق کی صفات سے ہر قسم کی مشابہت سے پاک سمجھنا۔
اور تیسرا؟
اور تیسرا، تفویض الکیفیہ، یعنی ان کی کیسے یا کیفیت کو اللہ کے علم کے سپرد کر دینا۔
تو یہ 3 ستون صرف علمی اصطلاحات نہیں ہیں؟
ہرگز نہیں، یہ دراصل ایک بہت بڑے چیلنج کا جواب ہے۔ ایک ایسے خدا پر ایمان کیسے رکھا جائے جو اپنی مخلوق سے بات بھی کرتا ہے، ان کے معاملات میں شامل بھی ہے اور ان سے محبت بھی کرتا ہے،
لیکن ساتھ ہی وہ ہر انسانی تصور، ہر مثال اور ہر تشبیہ سے بالاتر بھی ہے۔
جی، یہ منہج ان دونوں حقیقتوں کو، یعنی خدا کے قریب ہونے اور اس کے بے مثال ہونے کو ایک ساتھ تسلیم کرنے کی ایک فکری کوشش ہے۔
یہ واقعی ایک گہرا علمی جائزہ تھا۔ جاتے جاتے سننے والوں کے لیے ایک سوال چھوڑے جاتے ہیں جس پر وہ خود غور کر سکتے ہیں۔
جی ضرور۔
آج ہم نے جس متن کا جائزہ لیا وہ بار بار الہامی کلام کی زبان کو سمجھنے کے اصولوں پر زور دیتا ہے۔ یہ ہمیں سوچنے پر مجبور کرتا ہے کہ کسی بھی مذہبی روایت میں زبان کی نوعیت، چاہے وہ استعاراتی ہو یا حقیقی، ماننے والے اور اس کی مقدس ہستی کے درمیان تعلق کو کس طرح تشکیل دیتی ہے۔ کیا زبان صرف معلومات پہنچانے کا ایک ذریعہ ہے یا یہ خود اس تعلق کی بنیاد اور حقیقت کو قائم کرتی ہے؟